So with that in mind, I want to try to sort of talk through an economic framework for how we might think about these management actions and the timing of those management actions. So, you know, economics is fundamentally like a decision science and the study of scarce resources, of the allocation of scarce resources. And so in this context, we're thinking about specifically how to meet groundwater requirements. And the goal is the objective is to try to find the management strategies that meet these sigma requirements while making everyone who depends on groundwater, everyone and everything that depends on groundwater, as well off as possible. So what I'm calling that maximizing the well-being of society. And so we can think of trying, how should we go about, we're framing the problem by saying, let's choose a management strategy to maximize the net benefits, that is the benefits minus the costs over the time horizon, which in this case, we're thinking about this 20-year time horizon to reach sustainability. So we can use this framework to try to evaluate the actions themselves as well as the timing to figure out where are the benefits greatest over the possible costs across the suite of choices that could be made. And ideally, this includes everyone and everything that depends on groundwater that could possibly stand to gain or lose from a given management action. It's not, you know, specific to a certain sector of the economy, for example. So fundamental to trying to do this sort of economic calculation is putting a dollar value on everything that should come into this calculation. So there could be issues with certain components of this that we want to value, that such as water security and the environment. But the fear with sort of not trying to assign a dollar value to certain components might lead to these components being left out of the calculation altogether. And therefore, within this framework, that would implicitly give them a value of 0, which is problematic, obviously. So what I'm trying to argue is that there's benefit in thinking about the value of all these components that depend on groundwater so that we can enter it into the calculation to sort of weigh the costs and benefits and figure out which strategy makes the most sense from this economic framework. So to try to make it more concrete, I'm going to try to walk through this framework for specifically thinking about the timing decision of when a GSA should take action. And I'm calling this the early versus delayed action question. We're going to assume for simplicity that a GSA has already decided that they're going to take a demand side management action of limiting groundwater pumping by setting annual allowances of pumping. And they're doing this to try to meet some groundwater elevation goal by 2040. So the question is, when should they start limiting pumping? What is sort of the optimal timeline to roll out these groundwater allowances such that we can meet this goal of the groundwater elevation requirement while maximizing the well-being to everyone that depends on groundwater? So in order to do this, we want to think through what all the trade-offs are associated with this early versus delayed action decision. So what are the reasons to take early action? Well, if we take early action, then the basin can more quickly converge to sustainability, and you can stabilize the height of the aquifer table, the water table, faster. And so by doing this and converging to sustainability earlier, you could potentially avoid some costs of continuing along the status quo path, right? So we could potentially avoid some irreversible land subsidence or the loss of some domestic well supplies. It could have implications for the energy costs of pumping because you're changing the water table perhaps, and other value to the environment and ecosystems. But at the same time, there might be reasons why we would consider delaying action. If we delay action, then we put the costs of meeting these groundwater allowances or restrictions to somewhere down the line in the future. And the argument for why we might want to consider pushing costs into the future is that, so if we're thinking in an agricultural context, groundwater is, you know, a critical component of farming. And so by limiting this input to crop production, that it could lead to, you know, farm land fallowing and other adjustments that are costly and could have negative implications for the broader agricultural economy. And those costs, if they're experienced today from a groundwater cutback happening today, would sort of hurt more or be more costly than that same cutback happening sometime in the future. And that's because money today is worth more than money sometime in the future. For example, if someone was going to offer you $100 today or $100 in 10 years, you would choose $100 today because you could invest that, and in 10 years you would then have more than $100. And so the same logic applies in the opposite, where those costs happening today hurt more than costs sometime in the future. And so to try to make that slightly more concrete, I constructed this example. Just suppose that the cost to agriculture of a 10% cutback in groundwater use this year would be $100 million, for example, just a made up number. At an interest rate of 2%, $100 million today is equal to $119.5 million in 10 years because of compound interest. And so the value of delaying that 10% cutback from this year to in 10 years is that difference of 19.5 million. So this side of the equation is relatively easier to calculate in assessing this trade-off, because there have already been studies that come out about the economic impacts of sigma to agriculture, right? So we could pull one of those numbers and do this back of the envelope calculation. And I think it's a little more elusive on the other side of the equation when we're trying to value the benefits of taking early action. So, but that doesn't mean you can't make a strong economic argument for why we should take early action. And I think the fundamental component to making that economic argument for early action is to show that the benefits of early action far outweigh those costs of delayed action. So in other words, that's sort of saying, do the damages to, domestic wells and water supply security and the environment and other aspects of waiting to converge to sustainability, do they far exceed the benefits to agriculture of pushing the costs farther into the future? And of course, there's uncertainty in estimating all of this. There's uncertainty on both sides of the equation. But if you can show that one is of a magnitude greater than the other, then the uncertainty argument, necessarily drops out of it. So if I were to do this calculation, what I would want to know, this is perhaps coming from the fact that I'm an economist and not an environmental scientist, so I don't know some components of this. But if I were to try to do this calculation, I would want to know if a 10% reduction in groundwater pumping were to happen in 10 years instead of today, what would that mean for the domestic wells? How many would go dry? When those wells did go dry, what would the alternative water supply be? Because that's would be then helpful for me to try to determine the costs associated with a well going dry. You need to know what would happen if it did, right? And same with how would that delay impact ecosystems and the environment, and then taking the next step to, okay, and how do we value those impacts? So it's both understanding how the delay in pumping affects these things we care about, and then trying to attach a dollar value to those changes so that we can weigh them to the benefits of delayed action. So to conclude, in order to weigh the trade-offs of acting early versus delaying action, we need to know the costs and benefits associated with waiting or taking early action. The groundwater sustainability plans are required to include the benefits and costs of their management actions and a timeline. And I think these GSAs are making trade-offs all the time in the actions that they're choosing to take and the timing of those actions. And I think it's really important that every component, every aspect that's affected by groundwater, these management actions should be a part of the equation that is calculating these trade-offs. And so it can be really important to, figure out how to value these other components that don't receive as much attention and then can therefore get left out of the calculation altogether. And so a fundamental part of starting to estimate these benefits and costs is having a monitoring network and the data that's required to estimate the impacts. And so I'm going to pass it off to my colleague, Darcy, who's going to talk a little bit more about the monitoring network and the role of the monitoring network. And just before I do, here is my contact information. If you want to follow up and talk about anything that I just talked about, feel free to send me an email. I also have here a link to an evaluation survey for just this quick presentation. If you have a quick minute, it's just a Google form to help me work on my communication skills, and I would appreciate any feedback that you have for me. And here also is a link to the GTAN network that Corinne introduced. And with that, I'll stop sharing my screen so then Darcy can take it away.
Thank you, Ella, and hello everyone. Thank you so much for having me. Can everyone hear me okay? Cool. Okay, let me know. My internet may be a little spotty, so let me know if I need to repeat anything. Okay. Okay, can everyone see the slides? Yes. Okay, perfect. So, hello, I'm Darcy. I am as both Danielle and Corinne have said, I'm a graduate student at UC Davis, primarily studying the policy outcomes of SGMA, particularly looking at these GSPs. And today, as Corinne said, and Ellen ended with, you really can't measure what you don't monitor. And so it's really important to understand how we are monitoring and measuring all of these attributes of the groundwater system, and how decisions that different GSPs and GSAs are making about where they're putting their monitoring networks can impact the data that we collect. All right, so here's just a roadmap for what I'll be talking about today. First, I'll go into some definitions that talk about different components of the monitoring networks, and then I'll go into questions, things that you can ask now and in the future of these monitoring networks. But first, there's a lot of acronyms, and I'm assuming that most of you are familiar with these, so I'll just leave them here for now, and you can go back and visit them later. But I will be potentially saying a number of these acronyms, so I just wanted to listen here. All right, so first to definitions. As Ellen mentioned, there are requirements for GSPs to include sustainability indicators, and I've listed the 6 here. This is the DWR graphic. And this really is what DWR requires as a GSP's definition of sustainability, is the avoidance of these 6 undesirable results. And below the little graphics, you see the metrics that the GSAs or GSPs are required to use to measure these sustainability indicators. And so I'm going to give a brief intro to what minimum thresholds and measurable objectives are through this one example, which I'm sure many of you have also seen, of lowering of ground. So this one sustainability indicator. So for example, minimum thresholds and measurable objectives are required to be set in GSPs as ways to measure and define what sustainability means to a GSP. So minimum threshold is the lowest level at which undesirable results will theoretically not occur. And a measurable objective is the ideal level at which you want your basin to be at. So, you know, in this example, the groundwater level for your GSP that is considered most sustainable. Oops. See if I can. Okay, so just to rephrase a little bit in case that was confusing, measurable objectives are the ideals. It's where you want your groundwater levels to be or your water quality to be, whatever it might be. And minimum thresholds are the lowest allowable groundwater level or water quality limit for your basin to be considered sustainable. So with that in mind, I'll go into why those are important to note in a minute, but first I want to define what a monitoring network is. So a monitoring network is most broadly a collection of wells that together capture basin trends for each of those 6 sustainability indicators that I listed above. So you can have different monitoring networks for different sustainability indicators, or they can be the same. It kind of depends on, you know, what sort of data you have in your GSP or GSA boundaries. And also depending on where you are, the importance of each sustainability indicator varies, right? So if you're a coastal basin, you're probably going to be managing for seawater intrusion, but that's not so much the case if you're in the Central Valley. All right, so here's where minimum thresholds and measurable objectives come in, is with this subset of the broader monitoring network called a representative monitoring network. And minimum thresholds and measurable objectives are specified at this subset. So it makes somewhat intuitive sense because there'd be a lot of duplication of minimum thresholds if you had all wells in the monitoring network have minimum thresholds specified with them, because, you know, if you have 2 wells that are very close to each other that have very similar information in terms of groundwater level, water quality, whatever it may be, you would have the same minimum threshold. And so it's, you know, I think it's okay to have a representative monitoring network that is actually representative of the wells that are in your basin and the basin conditions that are occurring. So yes, so the 2 components are first a historical record. So in order to set minimum thresholds and measurable objectives, you do need information about basin conditions in the past, and so you can project into the future and really have that information in order to know what sustainability and undesirable results mean to you in your basin. And in addition, you need this historical record to demonstrate that your representative monitoring network actually includes wells that are representative of basin conditions and other wells within their boundaries. If you don't have historical records, which is the case in a lot of areas, what people do is include those wells anyways and hope, you know, building these representative monitoring networks is often an iterative process. And so where there isn't an abundance of information, I think remains to be seen in the future whether or not those representative monitoring networks are actually representative. So in short, representative monitoring networks are not all wells within a monitoring network, but it is what we have access to in the GSPs. So a lot of the GSPs that I've looked at so far don't include their entire monitoring networks. They just specify what representative monitoring networks they have for the different sustainability indicators. And they're important because, you know, these minimum thresholds and measurable objectives signal different policy management actions. So when a minimum threshold is exceeded, theoretically a management action occurs, like limiting pumping or something like this. So it's important to look at these representative monitoring networks. That's really, really the point. So now that we know a little bit about these representative networks and monitoring networks in general, I came up with a number of questions that I think are important to keep in mind now and going into the future, especially if you have an understanding of local conditions in different GSA areas. So I've separated these questions into a bit of a timeline. The first is now, what we should be asking now. And I think that it's really embodied by evaluation of the use of current available data. So this is all to say, is the GSP using all available information that they have, and are they using the most current information? What does that look like? The second is a progress check. So if there is insufficient information, even though, they're employing, best practices and best available data, do they have plans to install more monitoring wells? Have they done this at the 1-year update? And do they plan to do more in the future? And then the 5-year update is, something that all GSAs are required to write to DWR as well. And I think that this is really a chance where we theoretically have a lot more information. We have new monitoring wells that have years of data. And so it's really important to assess our minimum thresholds and measurable objectives again. So it's not to say that you can't assess them now. I think we definitely should, but this is also a chance where we'll have a lot more new information. And so I think it's important to look at how these minimum thresholds and measurable objectives are lining up. And so now I'll go into a bit more detail about more specific questions that you can ask. And so they're separated again by those different time slots. So first is now, assess use of available data. And really the main question I thought of was, does the GSP have a plan to monitor all relevant sustainability indicators? And this kind of has two components to it. The first is the GSP recognizing all of their beneficial uses and users of groundwater? And are they using that to inform what sustainability indicators they have decided to monitor for? So for example, what we've seen in some plans is that groundwater dependent ecosystems are not necessarily mentioned in the plans, and so they fail to also include monitoring for surface water groundwater interactions, which are really important for a lot of groundwater dependent ecosystems. So in this blue text that you'll see below, I have a number of examples that I'll go over as I progress each question. So the blue text is an example and the black text is just the broader question, to be more clear as well. And then the second question, or the second component of this first question is coverage. So once they're including every sustainability indicator, are they doing it, with enough coverage? Do they have enough monitoring wells within their system? And so, for example, do they have enough representative monitoring wells to monitor impacts to shallow domestic wells? In other words, are they putting representative monitoring networks or wells in areas that have a lot of shallow domestic wells? And this is really easy information to have access to. And it's really just a quick check almost, for the GSP, I would think also. But anyways, so those are two questions that you can ask now. Are they including sustainability indicators? And if they are, what does the coverage of those look like? So for example, this is just an example of thinking about the different nuances in looking and assessing these monitoring networks. So if you look at this GSP, this is a 2020 critically overdrafted basin. So if you look at this, those are their 10 monitoring wells for lowering of groundwater levels. And what it looks like is that there's really insufficient information. But if you overlay that with where most pumping is happening, and I understand that with this GSP in particular, I'm sure many of you are probably familiar with this, but there are a number of other problems with it. But just to illustrate that, you have these 10 monitoring networks. It looks like they don't cover a whole lot, but they are really looking at where pumping is occurring. So they're monitoring for changes in the water table due to pumping, at least in this case. All right, so now that we understand what sustainability indicators they have and what type of coverage they're using, it's important to look at what kind of data they're using to fill their monitoring networks. So are they using all available data? And for example, okay, so first are they listing the beneficial uses and users? This is also very accessible information. Community Water Center has a great website up now that also lists disadvantaged communities, but also has a lot more information on it that's easily accessible. And in addition, are they looking at GDEs? So are they going to this DWR site, the Natural Communities Dataset Viewer? Are they going there? Are they saying, we understand where our GDEs are? Yeah, again, a question that has easily accessible information. Yeah, GSAs can use this fairly easily. And in addition, another example of using all available data is using pre-existing monitoring networks. And these don't occur everywhere, but they are in some places and some portions of GSPs. So for example, on this, I think it's your left, the left-hand side is the Salinas Valley. And this is an example of a USGS water quality monitoring project that occurred a few years ago. So they used a monitoring network to monitor changes in water quality in the Salinas Basin. Similarly, in the Central Valley, there have been a number of dairy monitoring network programs that have gone on. So this particular program has gone on for a number of years, and there are existing water quality monitoring systems. So are they using these networks that have a lot of data available to them that really explain the state of the system currently? And so then finally, if they've done all that, and there's still gaps, which I think there definitely will be, and we are seeing, are there concrete plans to improve the monitoring network? So for example, have they applied for the Department of Water Resources Technical Support Services funding that is specifically designed to help GSAs find funding and actually provide technical expertise to build new monitoring wells? So have they provided a written, plan to increase their monitoring network, and where is that occurring? So that's a lot of questions that we can ask now. Thinking about the 1 year, so what do we ask in a year? I think it's really just going back and checking, has the GSP done what it has stated? Has the GSA done what they've planned? For example, are the new monitoring wells installed that, maybe they said they would apply for funding for the year prior? Yeah, I think maybe, it's also possible that there are new monitoring wells that are still planning on being installed. Maybe things are just getting underway, but I think it's really important to go back to the GSA or GSP writers and say, hey, where are you on this? What's going on with monitoring networks? And then there is a way to also look at whether or not the representative monitoring network is actually representative. So a lot of you have local contacts in a lot of GSAs. And so I think it's really important to look at, are people noticing changes in the water table or in water quality that are not necessarily stated in the representative monitoring networks? So you can use a lot of information from the ground to inform, the data that you're seeing at the GSA or GSP level, and then, use that as a way to say, hey, we're seeing a lot of changes. Maybe this network isn't so representative and we need more monitoring wells. Let's put some more in. All right, so at the 5-year mark, again, it's a time to revisit whether or not this representative monitoring network is actually representative. So a question that you can ask here is, are representative wells showing similar data to other wells in their proximity? So now that you have these new wells that are installed that theoretically really increase the coverage of the monitoring network, are they representative? Are they providing you information in an area where you did not previously have data? And if that's the case, then maybe you should be setting minimum thresholds and measurable objectives at those wells where there is, a lack of data in other places. So again, should minimum thresholds and measurable objectives be assigned at other monitoring wells as well? I think this is, now that you have many years of data from these wells, it's important to revisit. So the punchline, monitoring networks provide the information to assess current conditions and adjust our actions accordingly. In addition, there are many times in which you can get involved in advocating for better monitoring networks, so not just now, but in the future. And then just wanted to plug the GTAD one more time. We can assist you with answering these questions and many, many more questions, with writing comments on GSPs or really providing information before GSPs are finalized. So I wanted to thank you all for all of your work. I know there's a lot of great work going on here, and I'm happy to share with you. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Darcy and Ellen, for those awesome presentations. We are going to go straight into questions, and I think we're going to go until 4:15, so we have time for a few questions. We had a few comments in the chat, and then I see there's at least one hand, and you can use your raised hand function if you would like to verbally actually say something. But I'll start with the ones from the chat. So first of all, for Ellen, there were a few different comments about it being either really hard or impossible to put a dollar amount on certain things. So for example, Susan said, for those of us with salmon-bearing streams, it's impossible to put a cost on the loss of our fisheries becoming extirpated from groundwater pumping impacts. Raven also asked if there is modeling for estimating costs around those costs associated with not having any reductions for 10 years and asking about how they get valued. So Ellen, maybe you can speak a little bit to the sort of schools of thought that would allow you to put a value on that kind of thing and address some of these concerns.
Sure. I mean, I definitely agree that it's probably impossible to figure out, you know, the true value of a species going extinct, or sort of, I mean, you phrased it as a cost in the question, the cost of losing the fishery. But sort of, and I think this related to somebody else's comment about, you know, this framework of max benefits favoring some groups over others. And I think it certainly does favor some groups over others when this framework excludes certain groups, such as the fisheries, right? If we didn't try to put a value on the cost of losing the fishery, and sort of said it was impossible to do and therefore we cannot do it, then it doesn't enter this framework at all, and then would be definitely lead to you know, implications that are biased against the salmon. And so, yeah, I mean, all I can really say is I mean, I think it's incredibly challenging, but that it's important to try to do, in my opinion. And I think that, I mean, this is really where the field of environmental economics has emerged in trying to value some of these things that would be considered like non-market things. And so there's sort of like two branches of field of environmental economics that try to get at that sort of thing. One is like sort of this, what they would call a stated preference, where you could think about surveying people and asking them, you know, what the value is to them and using that information. And then there's also this revealed preference branch of environmental economics that tries to look at how people's behavior reflects the way that they value certain parts of the environment or ecosystems. But yeah, if it wasn't already obvious from what I just said, I mean, economics is definitely a very human-centered way of thinking, in that, like, essentially the value of having the fish is as much as we as humans value having the fish, if that makes sense. It's very human-centered. But anyways, so I hope that answered sort of the question.
Thanks. Yeah, I think that there's obviously a lot to talk about in this realm, and want to encourage participants to look in your packets if you want to follow up. I think all of our contact information is in there. So for now, let's go to the phone or audio. I see Dave Runson has his hand up, so I'm going to unmute you, Dave, and then you can go ahead and ask your question. Go ahead.
Yeah, it's a question for Darcy. Is there anything that would prevent using the shallow residential or farm wells as monitoring wells?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I am not sure. So I do know that there are instances where people have used residential wells, but I think that also involves the GSA, you know, contacting residents. So I don't think that there's a physical barrier to using a domestic well as a monitoring well or a farm well. But I do think that there are, you know, costs maybe associated with contacting a number of people. Right. Or like outreach costs money.
And then There's another question for Darcy in the chat that I saw from Felice. Says, what if the monitoring network is not adequate? The network can be gamed to avoid finding, for example, water quality issues.
Yeah, that's a good point. I just want to also point out that Raven and Nell both had really good points, which I did not mention, which is that, yeah, monitoring wells are definitely better if they're not, it's not great to monitor at a well that's currently pumping because you get, there's a cone of depression and you get really strange results, I think, or not accurate results. So monitoring wells are definitely ideal if they're not being used. Yeah, I just wanted to mention that point. And then the question, could you restate the question, Corinne? I'm sorry.
It's asking about the monitoring network not being adequate and being sort of gamed to avoid showing certain undesirable results like water quality issues.
Oh, interesting. I mean, I think you can definitely under monitor. I'm not sure about ways in which you can game the system by having more information. I think that would be maybe something challenging to do. But yeah, I think there's definitely maybe a desire to under report like water quality. You put wells where water quality is better. Although, I'm not sure. That's just, my thought.
I think that's probably where some of those questions that you put in the presentation come in to ask of your GSA to at least daylight some of that if that's happening. I see a couple more hands and a couple of questions in the chat, and we're not going to have time to get to all of them, but we'll take one more. Jacqueline, do you have your hand up? It's like a wavy thing. I don't know if that's a hand or not. I'll unmute you, or you're unmuted.
Yeah, it wasn't a question. I was just clapping for our presenters.
Oh, that's great. Okay, well, I saw Joseph also had his hand up. But now.
Hey, everybody. This one's for Ellen. It's really actually for us all. I think we probably all are aware that there's some widely circulating economic analyses about the, quote, negative impacts of SGMA on economic activity in the Valley. And I am wondering if you know amongst your colleagues or anywhere else where there has been a robust enough study to show the economic vitality that's created by protecting the current level of ecosystem services or even improving them. It's a key piece of the sort of battle for the hearts and minds, if you would, around SGMA.
I don't know personally of a study like that, and if other people do, I would love to see it.
Yeah, it's interesting because when we do environmental economics and for our perspective, if I would, it's always difficult for us to come up with numbers. And when our friends from the more traditional economics endeavors measure out costs, they always seem to have an easier time. And so they end up controlling the narrative about what really happens. Whereas it's even in a utilitarian view, like you presented, it's really an incomplete view. So I just want to flag that it's a challenge for us as a field.
Mm-hmm.
Are you asking about the Central Valley specifically, or?
I was. Yeah.
So I think we have to wrap the questions at this point, otherwise we'll eat too much into our breakout time, but there are a bunch, and I know they're in this running notes document. I just want to encourage everyone, again, to reach out to Darcy or Ellen or myself if you have further questions. And I just want to also note that I've seen some questions about whether you can get technical assistance on some of these issues, and you certainly can. So feel free to reach out to me if you want to follow up in that way.
And I think with that, we'll